In the heart of the Roman Empire, where power and faith intertwine into a tangled web, there existed a strange and almost supernatural group of women, the Vestal Virgins. They were neither warriors, nor queens, nor mysterious prophets. Yet the fate of all of Rome was bound to their breath, their steps, and their purity. A single small mistake, a sacred flame extinguished, or even an accusation of breaking their vow of chastity, could make the entire city of Rome tremble, throw its people into panic, and strike fear into those in power. This video takes you deep into a world where religion, politics, and an obsession with purity blend into a perfect system of control. You will witness 6-year-old children taken from their families, coercive and rigid rituals, absolute power that was also a tightening shackle, and the tragic fate of those buried alive in the dark. And that is not all. The journey will extend to other ancient rites, to medieval sports, and even to the shocking death of Alexander the Great. If you wish to understand how humans create symbols, only to be devoured by those very symbols, keep watching. This is a world at once mystical and merciless, a world impossible to forget. Continuing the journey we began earlier, where the sacred flame of Vesta was placed at the very center of the fate of an entire empire, we now step deeper into the world of those who bear responsibilities that even the most brilliant generals could not shoulder. And these are the Vestal Virgins. They were not merely priestesses, not just religious symbols, but souls silently sustaining the entire psychological structure of ancient Rome. To understand how a group of women could become the pillars of an entire civilization, we must begin with the unique position they held, priestesses carrying the destiny of Rome. The ancient Romans lived in a society dominated by constant fear, fear of natural disasters, fear of military defeat, fear of plagues, and above all, fear of falling out of favor with the gods. Every victory of the legions, every abundant harvest, every doorway to peace, was interpreted through the lens of divine favor or wrath. In such a world, the notion of purity was not just a personal virtue but a collective spiritual framework. Purity was equated with the stability of the empire, like an invisible thread connecting the altar to the battlefield, from the Temple of Vesta to the Senate. At the center of that thread were the Vestals, entrusted with maintaining the sacred flame. The flame regarded as the very breath of Rome. If it burned brightly, Rome stood firm. If it faltered, Rome could collapse. No religious figure in the ancient world resembled the Vestal Virgins. They were a curious fusion of priest, captive, symbol, soothing remedy, and political pawn. In a society where women had little voice, the Vestals were placed in a position both sacred and vulnerable. They were seen as the bridge between humans and gods, yet confined within standards so strict they were inhumane. It was precisely this paradox that made the figure of the Vestal both noble and tragic, revered and yet controlled. The Romans believed that their collective psyche could be stabilized through sacred rituals. The flame could never be allowed to extinguish, for they believed it symbolized continuity. The continuity of Rome was not measured merely by territory or army, but by the belief that the goddess Vesta was watching, protecting, and favoring the people. If a child died, it was a sorrowful matter. If a soldier fell, it was a matter of war. But if the Vesta flame went out, it was a dreadful omen. It would drive citizens to the temples, compel priests to perform purifying rites across the city, and bring punishment upon a Vestal. In the functioning of Roman society, the Vestals were the collective sedative. Their stability was Rome's stability. Yet behind this mystique and sacred duty lay a harsh reality. Vestal Virgins did not voluntarily enter this path. They were chosen from a very young age, sometimes as early as 6. They entered the temple as children but had to live as symbols. They were forbidden to love, forbidden to marry, forbidden to make mistakes. Their lives were weighed against the fate of an entire empire. What made their sacrifice heavier was that they were not asked for consent. They were entrusted with divine responsibility, yet denied the right to live as humans. The responsibility placed on these young girls is a clear reflection of how an ancient society managed faith and fear. Instead of confronting the uncertainty of history, they personified it, wrapped it in deities, rituals, and images of priestesses living among sacred halls. The presence of the Vestals gave Rome a sense of control, even when the outside world was chaotic. Whenever the empire entered a period of upheaval, when wars spread or the court was in turmoil, citizens immediately looked toward the Temple of Vesta. They believed that if the Vestals remained, if the flame still burned, Rome had not yet reached its end. The Roman sentiment toward the Vestals was a peculiar blend of reverence and fear. They were seen as, not of this world, as if walking among humans but living among gods. Every gesture was scrutinized, every mistake magnified. They became the spiritual anchor for hundreds of thousands, yet also the receptacle for the uncertainties, doubts, and obsessions of an entire empire. Their position was by no means accidental. The Romans understood crowd psychology very well. They knew that a collective symbol, ritualized, sacrificial, tied to fear and sacredness, would gain immense power. The Vestals were the product of such calculation, a religious symbol designed for political utility, a spiritual tool to ease the populace's anxieties. A group of people honored with beautiful rituals yet bound by inhumane constraints. Their existence was a paradox. They were women, yet wielded power far beyond ordinary Roman women. They were under constant surveillance, yet exempt from many laws. They could not love, yet were considered the heart of Rome. They had no freedom, yet were the emblem of stability. In every civilization, there exists strata sanctified to serve purposes greater than personal life. The Vestal Virgins were that stratum in Rome. What makes the Vestals remarkable is not just their religious function but their psychological role. They allowed the Romans to maintain a sense that the world was still in order. In an era without science to explain natural disasters or plagues, people clung to belief. And that belief was entrusted to little girls in white robes, walking among stone halls, tending a flame regarded as the soul of the empire. Looking back from a modern perspective, it is difficult not to feel a pang of sorrow for these women. Though revered, they were still tools within a larger system. Though granted symbolic power, they lived under the shadow of rituals meant to reinforce political authority. Though their names are etched in history, most had no private lives to remember, no freedom to choose, no dreams of their own. And it is precisely this contradiction that forms their tragedy. They were seen as keepers of Rome's fate, yet could not keep their own. They were central to the system of belief, yet mere specks within the machinery of power. A vast machine fueled by stories, rituals, and fear. To understand the Vestal Virgins is to understand more than a group of people, it is to grasp how the Roman Empire operated psychologically and politically. From fear of the gods to the need for social stability, from constructing symbols to controlling humans, all was embodied in the image of the priestesses who bore Rome's destiny. They are a mirror reflecting the ancient world. Beautiful, mysterious, powerful, yet merciless and fragile beyond measure. From the image of priestesses bearing the fate of an empire on their shoulders, our journey now takes us back to the very beginning, the moment a child is chosen, taken from the embrace of her family, and brought into a sacred yet restrictive world. If the previous segment revealed the metaphysical status society placed upon the Vestals, this part unveils the cold truth of how they were created. For no one is born a Vestal. They were molded, reshaped, and stripped of their childhood through a ritual both solemn and merciless, the captio. The ancient Romans called it captio, a word that sounds like a summons, but in essence, it was coercion cloaked in ceremony. When a girl of 6 or 7 was chosen, the family had no right to refuse. The state arrived, read a legal declaration, and took the child as though it were the will of the gods. In the Roman mindset, the divine will was absolute, no one could resist it. In a single morning, a child's childhood was ended, replaced by a path from which there could be no turning back. The selection standards were not only strict but in many ways inhuman. A future Vestal had to be flawless in appearance and lineage, with family purity beyond reproach and no rumors in the community. A small scar, a familial discord, or even whispers of ancestral misdeeds could disqualify her. They had to be daughters of families, clean, both legally and by blood. This perfection was not to protect the child, but to ensure that the Vestal image, already sanctified, was not tarnished by any element that could shake the public's faith. The children brought to the temple underwent a transformation that erased their former selves. Their hair was cut, a common ritual in the ancient world when a person assumed a role connected to the divine. Hair, to the Romans, symbolized youth and freedom. When it was cut, the child also relinquished herself. At the same time, they were given new names, wiping away all traces linked to family and community. The new name was not to empower them but to detach them from ordinary life. It was a rebirth dictated by society, not chosen by the individual. From a modern perspective, the ritual resembles a form of child imprisonment within a religious shell, erasing the experiences necessary for growing into an independent individual. But for the Romans, it was an honor. Families whose children were selected were seen as blessed by the gods, respected by society, and elevated in status. Yet the honor for society was a burden for the child. She had no choice, no voice, and could not comprehend the life awaiting her. What makes this process particularly noteworthy is that it was not unique to Rome. Many ancient civilizations had similar models, ritual hardships or systems removing children from families for religious service. At Delphi, young prophetesses lived in sacred caves and practiced isolation to become the voice of Apollo. In Egypt, children selected for the temple of Ammonius abandoned the marketplace life to serve as servants of God. In the Aztec civilization, children were brought into temples to prepare for priesthood or divine service. While forms differed, the common thread was systematically stripping childhood to create a class entirely devoted to ritual. In Rome, this transformation was especially rigorous because the Vestal Virgins were not mere nuns. They were spiritual pillars, political tools, collective symbols. Every action carried the weight of the empire. Thus, the molding had to begin while their minds were soft as clay. The younger the child, the easier she was to shape, more susceptible to becoming the model the state desired. During the early years of their Vestal training, the girls had to learn every ritual. From the way they walked, how they held the libation vessel, to the careful tending of the sacred flame. No hand could tremble. No fear could show. The discipline was often beyond what the girls could endure, yet no one cared. They were trained as perfect instruments, not to live, but to represent absolute purity. In the house of the Vestals, every minor action followed procedure. They were separated from natural life like a harvest removed from the soil, then replanted in a garden arranged by power and faith. They could not show inappropriate emotions. They had no friends outside the temple. They had no familial memories nurtured over time. They had only rituals and responsibilities. This leads to a heartrending paradox. The Romans loved the Vestals for their purity and sacrifice, yet that very purity and sacrifice was imposed. It was not a choice, but the result of a system that believed maintaining an empire required controlling even the most sacred elements. Purity was not a state of being, it was a political tool. Within this process, captio served as the opening of a life entirely reshaped. No parents, no family, no market-side playmates, no sunlit games. Instead, there were cold stone corridors, ritual masters with stern eyes, long nights listening to the sacred flame, understanding that it could never go out, simply because they were entrusted to keep it alive. Comparison with other ancient traditions clarifies the global spiritual context of the time. Across East and West, humanity believed that the most sacred tasks had to be entrusted to the separated from desire, from ordinary life, from personal identity. The fewer connections a child had, the easier she could become a vessel for divine power. And this doctrine inadvertently created lives that never truly belonged to themselves. In Rome, this process unfolded under the light of reverence. To the public, the selected child would live in the temple's wealth, enjoying privileges ordinary people could never attain. But no one asked what was exchanged for that privilege. A child could not grasp the cost. She only knew she had been taken from her mother. And that separation left a permanent mark, This transformation created a new human, belonging not to family, not to ordinary society, but to the temple. Belonging to Vesta. Belonging to Rome. And that very belonging made them symbols. Symbols that must not stumble. Symbols that must not doubt. Symbols that must not be human. Seen from this perspective, the initiation ritual of the Vestal Virgins was not a luxurious rite, but the gateway to a predetermined life, a life in which every step was arranged, every emotion constrained, and every mistake potentially catastrophic. 6-year-old children were drawn into the machinery of the empire, not because of fault, but because society needed them as symbols. The ritual carried the beauty of religion, yet contained the sorrow of humanity. A sorrow that reveals how these little girls built the stability of Rome at the expense of their childhood and self-determination. From this truth, the tragedy and the beauty of the Vestal Virgins begin to emerge, stepping gradually into the next chapters of a journey filled with ritual, power, and sacrifice. Amid the layers of time, as the door of Part 2 closes, we can still hear the echoes of sighs from those swept into the whirl of prosperity and decline. They sought light, yet inadvertently fell into the shadow of themselves. And from that very moment, the story naturally opens the path to Part 3, the magnificent house, and its imprisonment, a seamless bridge where opulence is no longer a destination, but a gilded cage enveloping human fate. In this section, we step into a space both radiant and heavy, as if every brick of the house were built from ambition, pride, and the deepest of fears. It was not merely a dwelling, but a symbol of an entire era. A house so breathtaking it overwhelmed the senses, yet its beauty did not bring joy, it revealed a subtle form of captivity, slowly eroding the soul. The house is described as a luxurious fortress, long corridors paved with smooth stone, walls adorned with intricate patterns, light reflecting through every windowpane to create a mesmerizing shimmer. Yet the deeper one ventured, the more one realized that this splendor resembled a perfectly staged play, designed to conceal utter loneliness within. Every object in the house whispered a story, but not of life, of presence, but of absence. Not laughter, but the echo of solitary footsteps. The house conveyed a sense as though time had frozen. Every detail was arranged with such meticulous care it verged on impassive. It evoked palaces of history, where kings and queens lived amid gold and grandeur, yet were lonelier than anyone else. This is the paradox of power and wealth: the closer one reaches material heights, the easier it is to lose spiritual freedom. The inhabitants of this house seemed accustomed to its beauty, yet could no longer perceive it. Like a person locked too long in a room fragrant to the point of forgetting the true scent, they gradually became part of the very cage they created. Each morning, they awoke to light filtering through thick silk curtains, yet this light no longer promised a new beginning. It only reminded them that another day had passed in unescapable stillness. The house is described almost as a living entity. It observes, it contains, and at times, it seems to whisper to those inside. In moments, it feels as if the house understands thoughts. It holds people, draws them in with its grandeur, then locks them within its own perfection. Not imprisonment by lock or key, but by the sensation of being unable to leave, a soft yet unyielding captivity. The confinement of the magnificent house did not come from violence, but from false satisfaction. It gave people the illusion of possessing everything, leaving them no motivation to step into the wider world. But because of this, their souls gradually shrank. Old dreams, once blazing hopes, now lay like silent ashes beneath a thin layer of dust. They no longer fought for their desires, they lived only to maintain the fragile stability of this golden cage. In commentary, the author's intention in constructing the image of the house becomes clear. It is a metaphor for an era when people became lost in the very values they pursued. The outer splendor always suggested safety, but that safety was only superficial. Beneath it lay fear of change, fear of loss, fear of confronting the truth that they had sacrificed too much to obtain what ultimately no longer brought happiness. The uniqueness lies in the attention to small details. A large mirror in the center of a room reflected not just the observer, but the emptiness in their eyes. Frames on the walls were not merely artworks, but repressed memories, untold stories. Even soft silk curtains carried an invisible weight, as if casting a thin mist of weariness over the space. The rhythm of this section reads like a long exhale. It is neither rushed nor dramatic, but slowly guides the reader into a contemplative state. The narrator's tone carries both nostalgia and a sense of entrapment. Readers seem to walk each step within the house, touch each wall, hear every sigh, and feel the silence so suffocating it becomes almost tangible. This pacing gives Part 3 its emotional weight. It is not merely description, but description of the mind. The magnificent house also reflects the eternal contrast between inner life and outward appearance. It shows that external beauty can deceive even its owner. Sparkling light may mask cracks, pleasant fragrances may hide decay, yet nothing can cover the growing emptiness within. The author never states it outright, but it is clear. This house is beautiful to the point of cruelty, for it forces one to confront what they do not wish to see. Viewed more broadly, Part 3 can be seen as a critical juncture in the overall structure of the story. If the previous part depicted the beginning of fascination, this one is the consequence. If the previous part was a golden light guiding the way into a dream, this part is the shadow creeping beneath, reminding that every dream carries a price. Nothing arrives naturally, and often what we desire most comes at the steepest cost. The longer one reads, the more one senses a subtle yet profound warning. Humans often think they control everything, yet sometimes it is their own choices that control them. They build a house for their life, only for the house to shape their life in return. Splendor ceases to be pride, it becomes an invisible shackle. This section concludes with a feeling both poignant and enlightening. It leaves the reader wondering. In our current lives, are we trapped in our own magnificent houses? Those things we once perceived as glory may in fact be the most insidious forms of captivity. And as the story prepares to open into the next part, the echo of that house lingers. It reminds us that every choice creates a door, but not every door leads to light. Some doors, once entered, demand immense courage to exit. As we step through the luxurious corridors where the Vestal Virgins lived, and grasp the stark contrast between the dazzling beauty of the house and the strict confinement they endured, another aspect, laden with pressure and responsibility, awaits revelation. This is the burden of the eternal flame, the supreme and sacred duty that each Vestal must perform, a responsibility in which failure is not merely a personal mistake, but a direct threat to the very survival of the Roman Empire. The flame of Vesta is not merely a physical phenomenon, it is the soul, the spiritual heart of Rome, a living symbol of the enduring existence of a vast empire. Each dancing flame in the sacred hearth, each flickering light in the night, carries the oath and soul of the young girls chosen to bear the destiny of the nation. In their role, the Vestals became guardians not only of the fire, but of faith, stability, and social order. They did not simply hold fire in their hands. They held the very soul of Rome, charged with maintaining a symbol that, if ever extinguished, would bring omens, crisis, and fear across every layer of society. The image of sleepless nights, with the Vestals standing vigil over the flame, lips murmuring prayers, hands tending the glowing embers, carrying solitude and extreme tension, allows us to feel the immense weight of this duty. Negligence was not permitted, laxity was forbidden, every moment the fire burned, or risked extinguishing, was a psychological ordeal of unimaginable intensity. Stories of Vestals committing errors and being punished, even buried alive, are not merely personal tragedies but harsh reminders of the power of faith and the severity of ancient religious law. Delving deeper, this burden is amplified by the profound symbolic meaning of the flame. In many early cultures, fire represented life, fertility, energy, and the continuity of the community. In Rome, the Vestals stood between the mortal and the divine, between the secular and the sacred, between political authority and spiritual power. They were a fragile yet crucial bridge, ensuring that the supernatural force the Romans believed in remained unbroken and unviolated. An empire reliant on faith, ritual, and devotion found its center in the Vestals, the lifeline that kept this energy flowing continuously. Their responsibility was further manifested in daily rituals. Cleaning the hearth, adding fuel, carefully adjusting the flame, and performing complex rites in which even the smallest mistake could have severe consequences. The Vestals lived in solitude, under constant scrutiny, under the pressure to be flawless, and under strict laws whose violation brought not only physical punishment but spiritual, as if the gods themselves enacted retribution. There was no room for negligence, no right to rest. They were accountable for the entire fate of the community. Every story about a Vestal and her flame underscores a reality: life and death, stability and chaos, could hinge upon a single small flame, upon the meticulous actions of young girls. They were not merely historical figures, they were living symbols of power, sacrifice, and the invisible pressure that religious authority placed upon humans. Understanding the burden of the eternal flame is to understand Rome itself, to see how belief, fear, and devotion combined to maintain social order, while also sensing the solitude, courage, and tragedy of the young priestesses who held the fire, never allowed to let it die. Moreover, when we view the eternal flame through cultural and psychological lenses, a timeless message emerges. Human beings, though limited by age, status, or law, can bear immense responsibility if placed in the right position. The Vestals are living proof that purity, dedication, and courage are not merely personal virtues but the spiritual pillars that uphold an entire empire. The flame is not just fire, it is destiny, it is soul, it is the duty of the youngest yet most crucial among them. In that flickering light, we see the tragic yet noble, the heroic yet sorrowful image of the Vestal Virgins. Priestesses bearing Rome's fate, living in solitude yet wielding ultimate power, caught between the mortal and the divine. They teach us that sometimes the smallest among us carry the greatest responsibilities, and that such courage and sacrifice will forever leave their mark in history, in the story of Rome, and in the eternal flame they cherished above even their own lives. When the light of the eternal flame has illuminated every shadow within the souls and responsibilities of the Vestal Virgins, we realize that their power does not lie solely in tending the fire, but also manifests in every gesture, every rule, and every privilege bestowed upon them by Roman society. From the young girls stepping into the house of the Vestals, dignity and reverence came hand in hand with profound solitude, yet also with a unique authority that no other woman in Rome could ever match. It is a singular paradox: the most revered beings must live under constant scrutiny and perpetual fear. The Vestal Virgins were living symbols of power and purity, yet their authority did not come from force or wealth, but from the sanctity they carried. They were allowed to own property, to sit in places of honor in public arenas, and even to grant pardon to condemned criminals, privileges that few Roman women could even dream of. But with such power came harsh limitations: every breath, every glance, every action was monitored and judged. They were not allowed to be human, in the ordinary sense. They lived within the bounds of ritual and law, as living emblems of the empire's stability and order. The tension between authority and fear created a profound spiritual tragedy. The Vestals could alter the fate of an individual, or even a whole community, through their power of pardon or participation in sacred rituals, yet any misstep or doubt regarding their purity could push them to the brink of catastrophe. They lived in constant tension, between dominion and pressure, between glory and the threat of annihilation. Their power was a spiritual force, yet a fragile one, entirely dependent on the perfect image of purity, a standard never to be broken. From a social and political perspective, the Vestals were also symbolic instruments to reinforce the authority of the ruling class. Their presence served as a reminder of social order, of the dominance of the Roman Empire, where religion, ritual, and symbolism were used to regulate behavior, solidify belief, and maintain stability. They were human, yet also symbols, bridges between the mortal and the divine, between humanity and supreme authority. Their power was inseparable from the veneration they inspired, and the fear they instilled in those who dared break the laws was also part of that authority. A striking aspect of the Vestals' existence was the way they lived within paradox: powerful yet watched, revered yet isolated, protected yet perpetually fearful. This contradiction created an image both tragic and awe-inspiring. Looking closely at their lives, we see a complex vision of power, not the power of violence, but the power of symbolism, belief, and sacrifice. Every step, every word, every gesture testified to silent spiritual strength and courage, even as fear lurked everywhere, reminding them of the consequences of the slightest error. Psychologically, the Vestal's power forged a close link between reputation, belief, and social order. They were not merely individuals, they were living embodiments of the ideals Rome cherished, that the stability of the empire depended on purity, devotion, and quiet sacrifice. In the eyes of the public, they represented supreme authority, yet in their own souls, this power was bound with immense pressure and indescribable loneliness. This delicate balance highlighted the tragedy they bore, a life filled with glory yet fraught with suffering, where power and fear walked hand in hand. Moreover, an analysis of how ancient religions used the Vestals to maintain political order reveals the sophistication in blending faith and authority. The Vestals became symbols wielded by the state, both authoritative and spiritual, to foster compliance and social control. They were proof of human capability when placed in the right position to serve a greater purpose, but also a reminder that power always comes with unceasing responsibility and pressure. The tragedy of the Vestals was not merely personal, it was the tragedy of an entire system, in which humans became instruments for maintaining order and collective belief. Finally, reflecting on the Vestal's power and privileges reveals a timeless lesson: true strength does not come solely from material or political control, but from the ability to embody a symbol, to bear responsibility for the beliefs and values of an entire community. The Vestal Virgins were not only priestesses tending the sacred flame, they were living embodiments of power, sacrifice, fear, and glory simultaneously. Living between two worlds, mortal and divine, they demonstrated that the greatest power sometimes belongs to the smallest among us, the souls entrusted with the fate of an empire. Within the light and shadow of that power, the story of the Vestal Virgins comes alive. Vivid, compelling, and forever haunting the imagination, evoking reverence, curiosity, and a mingling of awe and unease. As we begin to grasp the intertwined power, privileges, and fears in the lives of the Vestal Virgins, another aspect emerges: the ultimate tragedy and the harshness of the vow of chastity, casting their image as both exalted and terrifying. The vow of chastity was not merely a personal commitment. It formed the backbone of the entire Roman religious system, a determinant of the empire's very survival and stability. When a Vestal stepped into the sacred house, she surrendered not only her body and youth but placed the fate of Rome itself into her hands. The vow, outwardly pure but carrying immense weight, became a lifelong binding. The severity of this vow meant that any transgression became a monumental tragedy. Historically, cases of Vestals being buried alive stand as horrifying proof of the harshness and cruelty of Roman law. A Vestal's violation was not just a personal error, it was seen as an omen of instability, interpreted as a sign of divine anger toward the entire city. These tragedies left a deep imprint on Rome's collective memory, positioning the Vestals as figures caught between ultimate honor and extreme fear, where a single mistake could result in death. The image of a young girl buried alive, in utter isolation, vividly illustrates how religion, politics, and power intertwined to create manufactured tragedies, where humans became scapegoats for societal unrest. Delving deeper, these incidents were not merely stories of individual horror but also reflections of Rome's political mechanisms and social psychology. The Vestals were living symbols of purity, regarded as the foundation of social order. When a Vestal erred, it signaled not just personal fault but potential disruption within the community's order. Their deaths, however gruesome, were viewed as acts of restoring balance, a sophisticated sacrificial mechanism where individual tragedy merged with the empire's mission, becoming part of history and religious belief. It is precisely this intertwining of religion, law, and power that rendered the Vestals simultaneously divine and vulnerable, making their story more haunting than any other tragedy. Furthermore, the vow of chastity symbolized the extreme psychological pressure borne by these women. A Vestal had to maintain not only physical purity but also spiritual integrity, living under continuous observation and intense mental strain. They could not act freely. Every word and deed had to be flawless, for any doubt could lead to catastrophe. Isolation, combined with the immense responsibility, painted a tragic and poignant portrait of these priestesses, individuals bearing the burden not only for themselves but for the survival of a mighty empire. The politicization of Vestal trials amplified the tragedy. Suspicions regarding their chastity were often exploited to serve the ruling class's interests or to reassure the populace during times of instability. Thus, Vestals were not just individuals, they became instruments in a chess game of power, where tragedy and authority, life and death, were manipulated by forces beyond their control. This further highlights the loneliness and sorrow in their lives. They lived amid ultimate honor yet became victims of a ruthless power system. From a cultural and spiritual perspective, the vow of chastity and the live-burial cases exemplify how humans tie purity, belief, and responsibility to living symbols. The Vestals did more than tend the flame, they embodied faith, sacrifice, and fear. Their personal tragedies reflected the values the entire Roman society revered: order, stability, and dependence on the divine to maintain communal life. They were living testimony to the formidable yet fragile power of collective belief, where a single individual could influence the fate of millions. Viewed through a humanistic lens, the story of the vow of chastity and the Vestals' burials is profoundly poignant. We witness the tragedy of stolen youth, of souls bound by ritual, and of individuals forced to live under extreme fear to uphold faith and societal stability. Their courage, sacrifice, and suffering belong not only to the past but also offer a lesson for the present, that great power and responsibility are inseparable from pressure, and often, those who bear the heaviest burdens are the most vulnerable, but it is precisely this vulnerability that creates their extraordinary strength. Ultimately, reflecting on the vow of chastity and the associated tragedies, we realize that the Vestal Virgins were living symbols of the complex relationship between power, faith, and sacrifice. They teach us that purity is not merely a personal virtue but a spiritual pillar sustaining an entire civilization, that authority is inseparable from pressure and immense responsibility, and that personal tragedy can sometimes serve to maintain societal order. The story of the Vestal Virgins, with their vow of chastity and haunting live-burial cases, stands as a testament to the enduring power, tragedy, and significance of sacrifice, leaving us both in awe and profoundly moved, unable to turn away from this mysterious yet deeply human history. As we witness the tragedy, sacrifice, and immense pressure the Vestal Virgins bore to uphold their vow of chastity and guard the sacred flame, a pivotal historical turning point gradually unfolds. The collapse of a millennia-old tradition, where symbols of power, faith, and Rome's spiritual grandeur began to vanish before the sweeping tide of religious and political change. The Vestal Virgins, once spiritual pillars and living symbols of sacred authority, now faced an unavoidable end, as ancient values made way for a new faith, Christianity, with its growing and undeniable influence. The rise of Christianity triggered a cultural and religious shock, rendering all old symbols, including the Vestals, increasingly obsolete and, at times, even dangerous. The sacred flame of Vesta, once the spiritual heart of Rome, was extinguished by decree of Emperor Theodosius I, marking the end of a 1,000-year tradition. The Vestals faded into life like ghosts of a bygone era, evoking both nostalgia and the haunting fear of inevitable change, reminding us that even symbols once thought immortal must confront the inexorable passage of time and history. The tragedy lies not only in the Vestals' loss of power and sacred role but also in the disintegration of an entire system of belief and values they embodied. Vestals once symbolized order and served as the bridge between humanity and the divine. Their disappearance meant that Rome lost a portion of its very soul. This collapse is not merely a story about individual priestesses, it serves as a warning about the fragility of cultural and religious symbols. Even power and veneration accumulated over centuries can be erased by the currents of history. The end of the Vestals also reflected profound societal and political transformations. Christianity reshaped how people perceived the divine, restructured authority, law, and social order. Ancient rituals were banned, sacred symbols made way for new images and doctrines, and the Vestals, living emblems of the past, became silent witnesses to a bygone epoch. In this context, their story becomes both tragic and heartrending, demonstrating the power of history to shape and erase humanity's symbols. What is remarkable is that the fall of the Vestal tradition was not merely an end but a transformation of meaning. Their legacy did not disappear entirely. The image of the Vestals endures in culture, in stories, and in collective memory, testifying to sacred authority, extraordinary sacrifice, and unparalleled responsibility toward the community. They became symbols of a glorious yet tragic past, reminding us that all power, no matter how revered, must ultimately submit to the forces of time and social change. The demise of the Vestals prompts reflection on the significance of sacred symbols in human life. They were once the spiritual pillars of Rome, yet as society shifted, those symbols lost their place, yielding to new values. This does not diminish the Vestals' significance, rather, it underscores the enduring power of their influence, for even in death and disappearance, their story survives, haunting, inspiring, and perpetually resonant. The Vestals demonstrate that a symbol endures not only through tangible authority but through memory, commemoration, and timeless spiritual impact. Looking deeper, the collapse of the Vestal tradition reflects a historical truth: every system, no matter how powerful and long-standing, has limits. Rome was once the center of power, and the Vestals once supreme symbols, yet when the tides of history shift, all must adapt or vanish. This duality evokes both reverence and reflection, as we recognize that power and esteem are not immutable, they rely on collective belief and the surrounding social framework. In their end, the Vestal Virgins become a vivid symbol of the fragility and grandeur of both power and faith. The story of the Vestals' collapse also carries profound lessons about humanity and individual value. These young women, once tasked with tending the sacred flame, now exist as phantoms of the past, reminding us of the worth of sacrifice, the inseparable bond between power and responsibility, and the way time can transform everything. They are proof that human actions and choices, whether revered or forgotten, leave enduring traces, shaping culture and history beyond individual lives. Ultimately, reflecting on the demise of this millennia-old tradition, we see clearly that the Vestal Virgins were more than priestesses maintaining the sacred flame. They were embodiments of power, faith, and ultimate responsibility, living testimony to the complex interplay between humans, the divine, and history. Their disappearance does not erase the significance of what they represented, rather, it highlights the sacredness, tragedy, and intense emotion inherent in their story. The Vestal Virgins teach us that even symbols thought immortal must face change, and that their true power lies in living forever in human imagination and memory, transcending all temporal and spatial limits. Their story, at once tragic and profoundly moving, will forever haunt, inspire, and ignite endless curiosity in every mind that seeks history, faith, and humanity. As the Vestal Virgins and Rome's sacred symbols fade into the past, yielding to a new world, we step into the Middle Ages, a period where power, order, and society are vividly reflected through physical activity, games, and sport. In this era, sports were far more than mere entertainment. They acted as mirrors of social structure, power relations, and communal values. Through wrestling matches, chaotic football games, hunting, combat training, and falconry, we can observe how medieval society organized, controlled, and educated its people from an early age, and how sport became the clearest expression of status, responsibility, and duty. For the peasant class, community games such as wrestling or football were a means to demonstrate individual strength, build social cohesion, and release the pressures of a harsh, labor-intensive life. These games were neither formally organized nor governed by strict rules like modern sports. They were chaotic, intense, and raw, reflecting the very nature of the society from which they emerged. Strength, endurance, and resilience determined one's position and reputation within the community. In this sense, medieval sports were not just games, they were instruments of training and preparation, shaping people for the challenges of survival and community defense. Meanwhile, the nobility and elite used sport as a display of power and social status. Hunting, falconry, combat training, and mock battles were not only opportunities to hone survival and fighting skills but also served as demonstrations of wealth, authority, and leadership. Through these activities, one could see the deep connection between physical prowess and political influence, between personal ability and collective power. Every game and match was a lesson in discipline, honor, and responsibility, reflecting the hierarchical structure of medieval society and the mechanisms through which authority was maintained, demonstrated, and passed on through generations. What is particularly striking is that medieval sport trained not only the body but also the mind. From children's games to noble pursuits, every action carried a profound significance, building courage, teaching loyalty, fostering community spirit, and reinforcing social order. Sports became a power ecosystem, where the human body served both as a tool and a symbol of social position, status, and role. Matches tested not only strength and skill but also provided a forum to learn discipline, combat readiness, and cultural values. Sports also played a vital role in reflecting and sustaining social hierarchy. From wrestling and chaotic football to archery contests and tournaments, each activity mirrored power dynamics, responsibility, and status. Victory was never merely a personal achievement, it symbolized honor, reliability, and suitability for one's societal role. In the eyes of the community, a win was a testament to leadership, strength, and trustworthiness. Crucial qualities in a society where survival and authority were closely tied to physical capability. Additionally, sport provided psychological relief and fostered communal cohesion. In a society tightly controlled by laws, rules, and elite authority, physical activities and festivals offered rare moments of freedom, joy, and connection. They allowed children to learn, nobles to display skill, and communities to reinforce ethical values, honor, and loyalty. The very elements that maintained social stability. Looking at the broader picture, medieval sports were not merely physical activities, they were cultural mirrors reflecting society and politics. They exposed social divisions while illustrating how humans used strength, skill, and endurance to survive, advance, and exercise power. From the peasantry's fierce contests to the nobility's grand festivals, every activity was imbued with significance, responsibility, and societal expectation, creating a vivid panorama of the Middle Ages where body and spirit intertwined, and sports served as a tool for education, discipline, and social cohesion. Through the lens of history, sport also shaped personal and communal identity. It was a crucible for testing skill, strength, courage, and discipline, while simultaneously transmitting cultural, social, and moral values from one generation to the next. Sport allowed individuals to endure physically and spiritually, becoming a living embodiment of medieval society, power, and culture. Ultimately, when we reflect on the Middle Ages through the prism of sport, we realize that games, tournaments, and festivals were far more than leisure. They were living records of society, mirrors of power, hierarchy, and moral values. Through them, we understand that even seemingly simple physical activities were essential in maintaining social order, educating individuals, and preserving community cohesion. These vivid images, both intense and meaningful, inspire curiosity, admiration, and respect for the ways in which body, mind, and society interwove in a challenging world where every match was not merely a personal victory but a living symbol of culture and power in the Middle Ages. As we have seen that medieval sports were far more than mere games, they become windows into society itself, so too do festivals, tournaments, and the image of the warrior paint a rich cultural portrait. One in which physical prowess, honor, politics, and communal spirit blend to define the identity of an entire era. The Middle Ages were filled with intense, dramatic moments, yet these competitions, celebrations, and warrior roles were more than outward displays of strength. They were subtle reflections of culture, values, and social order, where every individual and family could find their place and purpose within the communal life. Archery competitions offer a striking example, where survival skills and military responsibility were both tested and cultivated. Archery was more than a pastime, it was a living lesson in focus, discipline, and preparation for real battle, where life and honor were inseparably linked. Through these contests, the connection between physical skill, intellect, and morality became clear. A skilled archer was not merely one who could strike a target, but one who understood the responsibility that came with strength, the weight of power, and the role they held in society. Archery became a tool to train both body and mind, while also allowing communities to recognize and celebrate those individuals who embodied courage and discipline. Similarly, tournaments represented the pinnacle of martial display, honor, and authority. More than competitions among knights, tournaments were political stages, where noble families showcased power, forged alliances, and positioned themselves within the social hierarchy. Each clash of lance and shield tested not only physical ability but also strategy, spirit, and honor. Spectators, from peasants to nobility, watched and judged, making tournaments central to maintaining cultural norms, social cohesion, and community identity. These festivals were not mere entertainment. They educated, disciplined, and reinforced societal values, turning the strength and skill of warriors into living cultural symbols. It was not only mature knights who benefited from these festivals and contests. Children also participated in games that mirrored a miniature version of society. Through play, young people learned honor, responsibility, cooperation, and strategy. This was how medieval society transmitted values and norms across generations. Children's games became lessons in social order, power, and community spirit, illustrating how culture was preserved, cultivated, and passed on through experience and careful observation. A particularly notable aspect was the intertwining of festival, competition, and religious ritual, where play was inseparable from spiritual and social meaning. Festivals often included ceremonial processions, music, theatrical performances, and displays of authority, reinforcing the connections between individuals, the community, and moral values, from honor and loyalty to solidarity. Warriors were not merely fighters, they were custodians of culture, tradition, and communal spirit. Every match, every celebration became a living symbol of cultural identity, reminding all participants of responsibility, duty, and their place within society. Events such as tournaments also vividly reflected political power. They were arenas where alliances formed, rivals identified, and noble houses displayed strength to consolidate their position. These contests were never purely personal, they conveyed strategic messages about power, influence, and honor. Victors gained not only material rewards but respect, prestige, and political leverage. In this context, warriors became symbols, and festivals became tools to maintain social order and assert authority. From a sociological perspective, medieval culture, through festivals and competitions, demonstrates how physical activity was used to educate, regulate, and transmit values. From peasants to nobles, all social classes participated in a complex system in which strength, skill, and spirit served not only the individual but the community as a whole. Festivals and tournaments maintained order, reinforced ethical norms, and created bonds across social strata, reminding participants of their duties and responsibilities. Moreover, a deeper look into these contests reveals that medieval culture was built upon the harmonious integration of physicality, spirit, and social responsibility. Each match and festival acted as a classroom, teaching control of the body, cultivation of the mind, and appreciation of honor, loyalty, and duty. Warriors learned not only how to fight but how to lead, protect the community, and embody the cultural values they represented. This is what made medieval culture both powerful and profound, both performative and instructive, a living tableau of society, power, and the human spirit. Ultimately, reflecting on the warriors, festivals, and competitions of the Middle Ages, we see that these were not merely stories of strength or entertainment. They were stories of how society built identity, trained individuals, and preserved order through living symbols. Medieval culture emerges in every contest, every festival, every game, reflecting social hierarchy, conveying moral and spiritual values, and educating generations in duty, honor, and loyalty. This was a world where body and spirit intertwined, where warriors became icons, and where every competition carried meaning, power, and deep emotion. A vivid cultural tapestry, simultaneously fierce, instructive, and inspiring, leaving all who witnessed it in awe of the complexity and vitality of medieval life. As we leave behind the festivals, competitions, and tournaments that painted medieval society through physical prowess, honor, and social order, the light of history guides us to another chapter. A chapter defined by the tragedy and legend of Alexander the Great, whose death shook the ancient world and left an indelible mark on human consciousness. While medieval games revealed how humans built and maintained society, Alexander's death exposes the value and limits of absolute power, the weight of personal ambition, and the profound influence a single individual can exert over the fate of an entire empire. In his final days in Babylon, Alexander, fevered, delirious, and desperate, embodied not only personal tragedy but historical catastrophe, as a civilization confronted the emptiness left by the imminent departure of its greatest leader. From his youth as a prince, Alexander lived an extraordinary life, where victory, honor, and power were inseparable from personal will. Yet, facing death, he became fragile and vulnerable, demonstrating that even the strongest among us cannot defy fate. Those final days in Babylon, marked by fever, delirium, and fading hope, serve as the clearest illustration of history's cruel irony. The man who shook the world now lay small and mortal before death. The simple gesture of raising his hand to his soldiers, though seemingly modest, encapsulated all of his greatness, tragedy, and regret, a moment etched into legend where power and humanity intersected in his final breath. Alexander's death was more than a personal loss. It triggered a prolonged political crisis and a ruthless struggle for power among the Diadochi, his successors. With no clear heir, the ancient world plunged into instability. Cities, kingdoms, and empires that had bowed to his vision suddenly became battlegrounds, their peoples caught in conflicts over territory, lives, and the legacy Alexander left behind. Through this, the death of even the greatest individual demonstrates that human power and influence are always bounded by the laws of history and the passage of time. Looking deeper, Alexander's death is a stark reminder of the cost of absolute power. He built a colossal empire, transcending borders, shaping culture, military strategy, and political systems, but all achievements relied on the health and will of a single man. Upon his death, the empire's stability immediately wavered, proving that personal authority, no matter how vast, is fragile, and no civilization can rest entirely upon one individual. It is a profound lesson on the precarious nature of power and how swiftly history and fate can overturn even the mightiest achievements. Alexander's death also carries immense symbolic weight. He was more than a king or warrior, he was an emblem of ambition, extraordinariness, and human potential. Yet his passing revealed that ambition and power always come with inherent risk and limitation, and that even the extraordinary cannot escape the immutable laws of nature and history. To the ancient world, Alexander became a model of greatness, yet simultaneously a testament to the fragility, tragedy, and fleeting nature of personal authority. From a humanistic perspective, the story of Alexander's final days evokes profound emotion. Sorrow, admiration, and awe for a man who lived and fought with all his might. His death did not diminish the value of his conquests or influence, rather, it amplified his greatness through the contrast with his helplessness before death, a tension of immense emotional power, leaving posterity both reverent and empathetic. The image of a world-conquering ruler reduced to a mortal, dying in Babylon created a psychological shock, not only for contemporaries but for generations to come. Moreover, Alexander's death sparked enduring historical and cultural debates, about succession, the influence of an individual over collective fate, and how history commemorates extraordinary people. The wars among the Diadochi demonstrated that one person could shape an era, yet upon their departure, the consequences of concentrated power became chaotic and uncontrollable. Alexander thus stands not only as a symbol of authority but also as a cautionary example of the dangers inherent when the stability of an empire rests on a single individual. Furthermore, his passing offers lessons about the interplay of strategy, humanity, and legacy. He left not only an empire but a cultural imprint, a vision, and military traditions that guided generations. His death shook the world, yet it also inspired imagination, ambition, and reverence among successors, historians, strategists, and all those who cherish history. Alexander became a timeless symbol, both legend and reality, a testament to human strength, and a reminder of the limits of that very strength. Ultimately, reflecting on Alexander's life and death, we see a panorama of emotion and tragedy, from immense power and extraordinary fame to vulnerability in the face of destiny and death. Alexander the Great did not merely shake the world with his victories, he shook the human soul with his passing, teaching profound lessons about power, ambition, and legacy. His story lies at the intersection of history, legend, and humanism, reminding us that greatness, ambition, and influence must ultimately confront the passage of time and the inevitable laws of life. It is this combination of magnificence and tragedy in death that ensures Alexander remains an enduring, haunting, and inspirational figure, not only for his contemporaries but for all who approach history with curiosity, wonder, and a desire to understand humanity and the world. Looking back on our journey through the world of the Vestal Virgins, we realize that these Roman priestesses were far more than mere keepers of the sacred flame. They were living symbols of power, ultimate sacrifice, and profound responsibility, where purity was inseparably linked to the fate of an entire empire. They endured childhoods cut short, lived under constant surveillance, and faced harsh punishments, all to uphold order and the collective faith of Rome. Yet the story of the Vestals extends far beyond ancient Rome, offering timeless lessons about the strength of symbols, the fragility of power, and the ways humans connect with the divine to shape society. Through tales of rituals, opulent palaces, political influence, terrifying trials, and ultimately the collapse of a millennia-old tradition, we are invited not merely to witness history but to feel it, with reverence, tragedy, and an insatiable curiosity about the mysteries of the past. Join us as we continue to uncover these historical stories, mysterious, haunting, and unforgettable, allowing each memory of the Vestal Virgins to shine as a mirror reflecting human strength, sacrifice, and the enduring power of legend across all ages.